I'm a huge believer that, I mean, everybody says the mantra, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Everybody knows that. I'm a huge believer in the fact that culture drives outcomes. You can give a great culture a hard mission and they will achieve it almost no matter what tools you give them, right? But it's the culture. And I started to break down what is culture? How does an anthropologist understand a past culture? And that's where it's in the book, but how I landed on it's the people, the practices, and the places. And as we talked about earlier, all three of these things are built to maintain the status quo by design.
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Logi, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Logi is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Logi offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Logi is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Logi is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Logi is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Logi for free. Visit aditonbbc.com/FTGN-Logi to get started. That's ADYTONPBC.com/FTGN-LOGE. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly, and today we're opening up the Green Notebook of transformation leader and author Phil Gilbert. Phil is the former general manager of design at IBM and the author of Irresistible Change, a blueprint for earning buy-in and breakout success. In this book, Phil lays out a powerful blueprint for creating change that actually lasts, whether inside a global company or a military formation. And I read this book recently, and it's one I've been recommending to every leader I meet because it forces you to rethink how change happens and what it really takes to shift culture, not just a couple processes. In this conversation, we explore themes at the heart of institutional transformation: why systems naturally defend the status quo and how leaders can overcome organizational antibodies, the role of deliberate design, clarity of intent, and voluntary adoption in scaling change, how to build a premium brand for change that people want to be a part of and they're not forced into, and the importance of culture, people, practices, and places as the true engine of long-term success. Phil challenges us to move beyond surface level initiatives and instead architect environments where innovation, accountability, and mission focus can thrive. His ideas will push you to re-examine how you build teams, develop culture, and steward change, especially in large tradition-rich organizations like the military. So whether you're commanding troops, leading a staff, shaping policy, or simply looking to become a more intentional leader, this episode will give you a practical and inspiring framework for driving real transformation, not just checking that box. So grab your green notebooks and please welcome to the show, Phil Gilbert.
Thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate it.
Well, I was reading your book last week, and I remember at one point the thought popped into my head is, man, like this is like a blueprint for leading change. And then I put the book down and looked and saw the subtitle of the book is A Blueprint for Earning Buy-in and Breakout Success. And I think that's exactly what this book is.
You know, I meant it to be very operational in tone. I, like many people who have led change initiatives, looked at a book that was written in the 1990s by a guy named John Kotter called Leading Change.
Right.
And it's kind of the Bible for change leadership. But what I found over the years is that people would use Kotter's language and actually thought they were following that approach. But it was so strategic that you could have different executions underneath it, many of which continued to fail. And so what I wanted to write was not only my experiences in leading a successful transformation at IBM, but also kind of the playbook or the operating guide that sits right next to Kotter's book on the bookshelf.
And that's why I think this book appealed to me, especially, as someone who spent their career in the military, is that IBM is an iconic company with what I would argue is a very fixed culture. And so, what you and your partners were injecting into this corporation, I would argue the experiences you had, even like the success you had, is very similar to what people have done in the military. So I think for military leaders, there's a lot that can be gained from what you did.
Yeah, I work quite a bit with military leaders as well as obviously enterprise leaders. And there is a huge similarity between these old organizations who themselves have had to change over the decades. And quite frankly, in IBM's case, in the military's case, over a century. And so there is something in the DNA that allows for the possibility of that change. But because of the age, it is inherent that we calcify. Whenever there's a change that happens, people start running that playbook and the status quo becomes uncompetitive. And so you need to reignite those fires of change. And what has traditionally happened, just because of the pace of change over the last century and a half, it's kind of been generational. Right. And so you had the time to tap into those that change DNA. That's not the case anymore. Our changes are coming too fast. And so I feel like organizations need to build the institutional outlook of challenging the status quo, not every generation, not every decade, but all the time. And if that's the case, then we also need to build up very specific muscles that allow us to inject the right change at the right time.
Yeah, there's a favorite quote, and I don't remember who said it, but it's the status quo is resilient. And you're right. I'm thinking it back to my time at JSOC, which is one of the most innovative organizations within the Department of Defense. And, McChrystal, what he wrote about in his book, Team of Teams, which I'm sure is somewhere on your massive bookshelf behind you. But, he reinvented the organization to face the threat they were facing at that time. And you flash forward 10, 15 years later. And I remember we were having a conversation and he was talking to the organization, and it was like the changes he made became hardened into almost commandments, and the environment had changed again. And it was really, we had to bring him back in to say, hey, like you got to smash the tablets, and start evolving again.
Yeah. So right after that book came out, I reached out to Stan and we've become friends. And in fact, Stan was gracious enough to endorse my book. And he's got a fantastic, I think, blurb on the cover talking about, turning IBM around is like turning a battleship, and it really is. But yeah, that's what happens. And I think it's interesting for your listeners to realize systems are built to maintain the status quo because that's how we scale large organizations. It's not bad to scale the status quo right up until the second that it is bad.
Right.
And that's when you need to have this, institutional capability of, okay, we've run this play before. We know how to lead change, and we need to adapt fast. Because we can't have bespoke systems, all around the world for every unique situation. We have to scale with some consistency. We also have to be constantly sense making inside our organizations to understand when the status quo is failing us.
Well, very briefly, because I really want to get into your approach to this, could you describe the effort that you undertook at IBM? I think like the scaling of, or you cut a lot of major programs and whittled those down. And I think as you describe it, I want people to think about the antibodies.
Yeah.
Because like you said, for every change that you make and it settles into a system, that system becomes hardened and rigid.
Yeah. It was interesting. So when my third startup got acquired by IBM in 2010, and I was asked to lead the relatively small unit that had bought my company. And when I say small at IBM, that's about 1,200 people. And the thing I was asked to do was, we want you to make this unit more like your startup and less like IBM. And so I did that. And over the next 18 months, we scuttled 40 of 44 products. We really simplified our portfolio. We simplified our operating mission. And in so doing, we not only took pretty massive market share from competitors, but we also really changed the dynamic of morale inside the organization because the mission became very attainable, and we went out and did it. When Jenny Rometty, who had just become CEO in early 2012, heard that story, she said, "Whatever you did there, can you do it everywhere?" And that was when I realized I needed a couple of things. First of all, in the organization that I led. And if you lead it, you can be a little more draconian with respect to people that do or don't kind of follow along and what have you. And I had done it somewhat intuitively. And yes, we cut products. We brought in some new tools. We did all the things that you do of change, but I had done it relatively intuitively. And when I realized that the next challenge was changing 400,000 people, none of whom reported to me, that really presented just a very different kind of set of thinking that I had to go through. And that's when I came up with kind of the two primary animating levers of the transformation. The first was I no longer could tell people what to do. I had to get people to come along. I couldn't tell 400,000 people what to do. And in fact, all of those 400,000 people, ultimately, the only common person that they reported to was the CEO herself. And she had a day job other than running a transformation and changing how people did their daily work. And so I realized that the whole notion of the whole way change had been done in the past, which was very enablement focused and very focused on individual training, was completely wrong. I had to approach this from a perspective of people wanted to come in, no mandates. I had observed over the years that mandates typically end up in performance theater. They end up in a lot of compliance, but they rarely lead to the outcomes that the mandate was put in place to achieve. I had to make this voluntarily adopted by every single person in the organization, which meant I had to make this as desirable as a premium product. And if people failed to come into my product, I had to own that. And so on my leadership team, I made the words, "They just don't get it," verboten. If I ever heard that from my leadership team, oh, they just don't get it. They were dinged. Let me just put it that way. We had to accept our failures, and that created a very different mindset. So the product mentality, a premium product that people opted into, was the first kind of thing that I did. And then the second one was I had to come up with a program across 400,000 people. You're not going to achieve adoption and change day one or quarter one. It's going to take some time. And so I had to come up with a set of in-process metrics that I could benchmark myself against, and which the senior leadership of the organization could see progress against, so that they could feel that this was scaling with some degree of certainty, even though the broad scale outcomes weren't being achieved this week, this month, or even maybe this quarter. And that was when I came up with the formula of the three things that drive culture are people, their practices, and the places, the habitats in which they do their work and live their lives. People plus practices plus places. And I felt like if we changed something about all three, and unless we changed something about all three, we would not change the outcomes.
And that, I think that's why I love this book so much, is because, in my experience, people take one or two of those for granted. And like you said, they die. They'll have a commander's initiative, which will work for a little bit. You'll get a little bit of compliance, and then I'll die off. Or they'll form a tiger team of people that'll do a very special project, but then somebody leaves, or the leader leaves, and those die. And none of those things are ever, they don't live beyond the commander who instituted them. But this approach that you did, this multi-pronged approach, basically covered all the bases. And I think, like, if I could pull one word to describe it, was very deliberate. Every step of this change program that you instituted, every facet of it, from communication to the people to the projects, even the name of what you're doing. Like, I was doing research and looked at the sign. You didn't call it like an innovation lab. You called it a studio.
Yep.
And I think I think that's what I want people to walk away from this episode. And if they read your book, and I can influence what they walk away from, is you can't take this stuff for granted, because it's real.
Yep.
And if you do, some point, one of those places that you just talked about is going to fail you. And it's something that you could have foreseen, and actually made, affected change in that one arena.
Yeah. I'm a huge believer that, everybody says the mantra, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Everybody knows that. I'm a huge believer in the fact that culture drives outcomes. You can give a great culture a hard mission, and they will achieve it almost no matter what tools you give them, right? But it's the culture. And I started to break down, what is culture? How does an anthropologist understand a past culture? And that's where it's in the book, but how I landed on, it's the people, the practices, and the places. And as we talked about earlier, all three of these things are built to maintain the status quo by design. They're built to. Even our places are built to reinforce existing, how we want people to interact with one another. And if we don't change those things, if we don't change something about all three of those things, the status quo is going to pull us back, always. So, that became, for my leadership team, every single person on my leadership team had to have a people, a place, and a practice change in their 6-month goals. The second thing you talked about there is language. Language is huge. Most change initiatives are called by their thing. If you're moving to an agile, workforce, or an agile military force, or in our case, design thinking and agile, or today AI, they're typically labeled with that thing. And that does two things to the organization. First of all, it it typically means that you have an expert in that thing in charge. And that kind of blinders to just the practice, just the method, just the tool. And people bring their own baggage to those words. If you ask, 400,000 folks in the military, just like 400,000 people at IBM, to define AI and how they feel about it, you would get roughly 400,000 versions, all of which are very baked deep in their soul. So that's the first thing is now your alignment problem is exponential what it needed to be, because you now have to align by changing people's views of this word. The second problem with that is that it tends to put blinders on the leadership team themselves of the transformation, because now all of a sudden the transformation becomes about agile, it becomes about design thinking, it becomes about AI, and it doesn't become about every single system and tool and thing around AI in this example that is thwarting its adoption. So we chose a very neutral word, in our case, hallmark, and you read about in the book and my thoughts about naming, but that allowed us to create this premium brand that was originally a neutral word. But when we built all of the intentions and all of the outcome expectations around it, it became much bigger than just design or agile or AI or whatever it might be. And it really gave us the freedom to change everything, not just that one thing.
And you talk about premium brand, and another thing that I've seen play out time and time again is that people will take a piece of the program, they'll water it down, and then they'll bastardize it. And then it fails over there. And then you're like, see, I told you it wouldn't work. Yep. And so how important is it to, once you brand it, is to control that brand to ensure it remains premium throughout?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, it's like Louis Vuitton going after, people that rip them off. You have to rigorously protect it. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. The reason how I came to this kind of thought was the exact situation you talk about. I thought we'd start this program up, and while we were inviting teams in, I would have somebody out there in the hinterlands give me a call one day and say, hey, Phil, I'm doing this thing, give me some advice. And I'd be blah, 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 and hang up and forget about it. And they would go take what I said, try to implement it, do it badly, fail, and then start, tarnishing my program with something I didn't really even deal with. And so I realized that I needed a way to separate the teams that were officially in and those that weren't yet. And that's how the first idea even came up. Well, a few things happened. First of all, Hallmark became this very coveted brand. And once you give something a name and you don't let everybody in, guess what happens? Everybody wants in. And now all of a sudden I had changed the dynamic. Again, this was kind of unwittingly to a little bit. I had completely changed the dynamic where I thought I was going to have to go sell this thing. It turned out that after the first 180 days, we, for the next 4 years, had significantly more demand than we could handle. And a lot of it was this, velvet rope effect of not only were they hearing good things from these teams, but what? We're supposed to change. I can't get in. How do I get in? So, yeah, that was all part of the psychology of making this a coveted thing. But protecting that brand is defining the brand with the real values and intentionality and the outcomes that you want to communicate, but then defending it rigorously. It got to the point where I told the CEO, I said, I love IBM, but if it's not somebody who's in the Hallmark program, I'm just letting you know I'm not even going to talk to them. And that was like, what? And as I explained it to her, she was like, you're right. Stay focused.
I love that. And, like one of the things that from the Green Notebook that we really promote is 3 pillars: reading, writing, and reflection. Like the importance of leaders doing that to lead with the best version of themselves. And I can't tell you how many times I've had commanders email me or tell me a story. They're like, "Oh, this is great. I'm making every one of my team members write an article. They have to read this." And they're like pushing compliance and not selling a belief in it. They're making them, and it like kills me because I'm like, now
Right.
you've just created a bunch of antibodies in your formation.
That's exactly
Who
right.
don't want to read, don't want to write, don't want to reflect.
Right.
And so again, like when I read that about branding and controlling the brand, I was like, this is
Yeah.
genius. Yes.
Yeah, because it keeps you focused on the outcomes, because that's what you're trying to change, and a lot of people, even in, again, our particular thing at the time was design thinking and agile. There were a lot of people in both of those communities that would, give me trouble because I wasn't super dogmatic about the rituals of each of those things. It was more about the mindset
Right.
and the outcomes that came out the other end. And so our teams had quite a bit of execution freedom around these things. In fact, and there's a whole separate discussion that I didn't get into in the book. Part of the methodology itself, a big part of it is actually built based on commander's intent and the how you do that to align teams. But this notion of getting alignment around the intentions and the values and the outcomes that we want, if you can get there, then all of the practices that you want to input into that will come naturally and be adopted.
Well, one of the things too that you compare this to turning change, like bringing change to an organization, is turning it into a virus. Could you describe that for a little bit? Again, that was something that, as I was picturing it, I was like, yes, this is what makes sense to me, and I'm sure it would make sense to a lot of my listeners.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, because this was opt-in, and I believe that real adoption only comes from teams that have agency, and so this notion of optionality is big for me. Then I had to start thinking about, okay, how do we get this broad set of people to adopt, and what does my leadership team look like in doing that? I've got to create something that essentially goes viral among 400,000 people. It's opt-in, therefore it has to be wanted. It's got to go viral. I've got to get into the metaphorical DNA of IBM to make these changes happen. And so as I started thinking about how to be thinking about my leadership team, it occurred to me that this thing that we were doing, the tactics of it, the specific, what I call the change provocation, which today would be AI, for example, that's actually a relatively small part of the problem. A bigger part of the problem is how do we protect this, because it's only being disseminated as much as we can. In the first year, it's a few teams. In the second year, it's a few dozen teams. And in the third year, it's scores of teams. So we have to have a protective shell around that. And so then I really came up with this. The metaphor is the genome, the virus, is protected by the capsid shell. And this is where we have the leaders who are actually engaging with the scaled out parts of the organization. And then you have your subject matter experts delivering the tactics to the teams as the genome. So I designed my leadership team kind of literally as how a virus is formed and then communicated.
And a lot of times too, again, I have so much scar tissue with change. But like I've watched leaders try to pass this off and not be involved. Like, hey, you guys go do this thing. How important in this whole process? Because when you talk about the protect aspects of a virus, was it Gina, the CEO?
Jenny.
Ginny, yeah, the CEO of IBM. How important was her? Like her rewarding communicating to the people who are actually going through your program and their managers as well when they were going back out into the force, so to speak, or to the greater IBM.
Yeah. Hugely important. But let me kind of dive below that, because that's kind of a top line. Obviously, senior leadership support is important. Jenny's direct involvement, I would say Jenny and her directs. So that group of about, in our case, across 400,000 people, that was about 15 people. So a pretty small set of very senior leaders in the organization. It was Jenny and her leadership team. Part of my requirements for accepting the role was, I said, I need to have quarterly meetings, one-on-one meetings with all of you. It was actually one-on-one meetings with Jenny, with her directs, and with their directs. So it got down to that level, and that was about, 40, 50 people in the organization. And so quarterly one-on-ones with those. And as you know, to get quarterly calendar time with that level of individual is non-trivial.
Right.
And so that was kind of a big deal. And that in and of itself sent a signal, not only to the organization, but to all of the middle management and to that team themselves, that this was important. And so Jenny really helped secure that time on everybody's calendar. Those meetings became very operationally focused. They were only 15 to 30 minutes long, once a quarter. But in that period of time, I would communicate to them how their teams were behaving. I didn't go over the details of what changes of design thinking and all that. It was but how are their teams behaving? And then if there were any bad behaviors, I would talk to them, and they would typically get them sorted. And I tell a couple of stories about that in the book. But what I was really interested in were the good behaviors. And this was the thing that was surprising to the organization, because they thought I was going to use those meetings as a hammer, but I was really going to use those meetings as a carrot. And so at the end of each of those meetings, every one of them, I had 3 people at the lowest level of the organization, the people on the teams doing the work. I had 3 emails pre-crafted, and my closing thing for every one of those calls was, I want you to send these 3 emails from you to that individual and copy their manager to let them know that they're doing a good job. And I tell you, you get somebody who's, a 4-star sending a private, an enlisted person an email and copying their boss, hey, you're doing a good job. This is important to me and it's important to the organization. That spreads pretty quickly. And then all of a sudden, when it happens quarter after quarter after quarter, that sends a huge signal to the organization, not simply of the change, but that the organization has the fortitude to see the change through.
I'd like to introduce you to our newest partner, Roger Bank, a modern digital military bank built by military members for military members. Whether you're stationed stateside or overseas, Roger is designed to meet the unique needs of our men and women in uniform. I recently opened an account myself, and the process was incredibly smooth. It took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. Now, here's why I'm excited to partner with Roger. They offer high-yield checking and savings accounts, 0 account fees, early payday, and automatic savings with Roundup Match. Their military-ready direct deposit form is even auto-populated and signed by the CEO, saving you time and hassle. Plus, you get free global ATM access, real person customer support, and they even offer accounts for service members as young as 17. Funds are FDIC insured through Citizens Bank of Edmond, so you can bank with confidence and peace of mind. Visit roger.bank to learn more. That's ROGER.bank. And, you're an expert in design thinking, but in order to inject this virus, you were the things that you're telling me aren't design thinking.
Right.
There are other leadership skills and behaviors, but that are absolutely necessary. I mean, to me, just hearing that's genius. It gets the leaders involved. It's a reinforcing function, and it really helps get the flywheel spinning, so to speak.
Absolutely. The other thing that it did was, I hadn't appreciated at the time I'm sure this will resonate with you, but I hadn't appreciated at the time how disconnected from the work that the very senior leaders were.
Oh, yes.
And this connected them to the work. And let me tell you what I found. They were thirsty for that information because it was scrubbed out. One of the things that scared the organization about me leading this effort the most was this demand for one-on-one meetings with the most senior leadership. And I was going to talk about the teams doing the work. There wasn't going to be vetting of that PowerPoint going up all those chains of command. Nobody was going to get to see what I was going to say about them, about their teams, about their, the people they reported to. It was a very scary thing. But all of a sudden, the most senior leadership was getting unfiltered information. And by and large, and by the way, I had no incentive to talk badly about people.
Right.
My incentive was actually to promote the program and to talk about the good things, which is what we did primarily. So it was it's a great tactic. And once that happened, those leaders started demanding these operational metrics that they weren't getting, started demanding changes in our global performance management system. So today at IBM, many of the operational details of these teams, the team makeup, in our case, how many designers, how many engineers, how many, down to this level of what are the ratio of skills do you have, and what is the experience level of each of those skill sets across the team, across the unit, across the organization. These were levels of details that our performance management system didn't have. Today it does, and it was because these leaders realized the value in understanding the operational profile of their teams at a much more granular level than they thought they needed to.
I was going to wait towards the end to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it now. If you're listening to this episode, Phil has a ton of books behind him, just like I have behind me. And so we even have some of the same books on our bookshelves. But like what you're talking about is human nature, which I think a lot of times when people get so excited about the change, they don't think about all the antibodies that are throughout the organization. And I know you led a 1,200 person company, but has reading been a huge, was reading a part of this? Like you were pulling lessons that you've read in books, mixing it with your experience, and then bringing into this, which is why it seems like you had all your bases covered with this change initiative.
100%. I mean, some of the best books I've read in the last 20 years, that have made a lasting impression on me from a leadership standpoint. For those who don't know it, Made to Stick by a guy named Chip. It's actually brothers, Chip and Dan Heath. Made to Stick taught me the value of communicating and the value of communications. Stan McChrystal's Team of Teams really hit in the middle of our program, and he didn't come to it through design thinking, but we ended in the exact same place. The things he talks about, the radical collaboration, the one call a day instead of 24 calls a day with everybody on it. All of those things. That was the same thing we were doing at scale. But there was one funny coincidence that I'll talk about, which is again one of the best business books I've read in the last decade. We, as any initiative will have it, you have a bell curve of execution. You have some teams that are doing good. You have some teams that are doing bad. You can't beat the mean, right? But I was curious, the 10% worst teams, they were kind of obvious as to why they were not performing well. The 10% best teams were kind of natural athletes. They're always going to succeed. That middle 80%, I was real curious about 3 years in, and we had enough teams in the program that we could really do some detailed research. And so I asked a couple of the ethnographers on our team, of the middle 80%, who all appear to be wanting to adopt this thing. They really did. What makes of that middle 80, what makes the top 40 the top 40 and the bottom 40 the bottom 40? Why are these teams, all of whom are trying, what makes some better than the other? I'll cut to the chase. There were kind of two findings, but one, the headline finding was they said on the teams that are winning, we have found an individual that has taken on this mindset so thoroughly that they're holding their teammates accountable for the outcomes. And some of them were introverts, some were extroverts. They did things in very different ways. They weren't all designers, they were engineers, they were product managers, they were marketing people, they were all coming from all different fields. They couldn't quite identify who they were. And so we called them our magic people. And we started looking for magic people. But getting back to your question about books, at exactly that moment in time, a book had come out that I had just read. They were telling me this research findings. I had just read a book. All of your listeners should read this book. It's called The Captain Class. It's by Sam Walker. He's the ex-sports writer for the Wall Street Journal. And he wrote a book about why are the 10 best sports teams of all time, the 10 best sports teams of all time. And if you're a sports fan, it's awesome because the first, 75 or 100 pages are figuring out who are the best sports teams of all time, which is a fun exercise. But then he goes into it and he interviews all those teams or interviews leaders on all those teams. And what he found was it wasn't the superstar. It wasn't the paid coach or manager. It was the captain that the team elected. And that was the person that made the magic happen. That was the person that held the teammates accountable on the pitch or on the floor and in the locker room. And those were our magic people. And so I took everything that Sam had discovered from this book, as well as everything that our researchers had found, and we created a heuristic to actually very proactively find and scale magic people. We ended up calling them coaches, but to scale those across IBM. And today at IBM, there's a guild of coaches that's thousands strong. And these are people all around the world that can be called in. We will intentionally, or when I was there, we would intentionally put them on new teams that were being formed because it only takes one or two to change an entire team's dynamic.
Yeah, it's funny. I was reading that chapter or that section on magic people, and I put the book down to I didn't get to the part where you cited Captain's Class because Sam was on the podcast. I've interviewed him. And so
really?
I went to go find the book because I was like, when I talk to Phil, I'm going to, talk about, the guy on the team who's carrying the water. And I was like, I don't have enough time to find it because I couldn't remember what the spine looked like and my books are all out of order. And so, anyways, I was like, all right, well, I went, listened to the podcast. I was like, okay, I'm ready for it. And then I get to the very next paragraph and you talk about that book. So yes, I'm also a fan of Captain's Class as well.
That's great. Yeah, it's a fantastic book. So those three books, Made to Stick, and I'm sure most of your readers our listeners have, I'm sure, got Team of Teams, but Made to Stick and Captain Class are.
Yeah, those are all great books. And speaking of the Heath brothers and the importance of communicating, to make things stick, that was another aspect of this program that you were very intentional about, was not only communicating down to the program, but communicating out as well. And could you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's another often overlooked thing. And I'll tell you, in the military, sometimes we get stuck on an evangelism.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a term this British officer shared one time is PowerPoint tourism, where we will take a picture of something that we've done and then it'll send up and go around, but nothing will ever come of it. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And it kind of ties into that previous question. You said, what's the role of, Jenny and her directs? She and I intentionally kind of limited her role at the beginning. I feel like a lot of change efforts derail because the very senior leadership gets way out over their skis before there's any real proof to be shown. So I actually think that, we tend to over communicate, BS and evangelize the possibilities. We way overdo that. And so we were looking for a different way to tell the stories. And it was actually one of IBM's longtime communications persons that I was on my leadership team. And in our first boot camp, which we can go into the book or we can talk about here, whichever. But in our first boot camp, about halfway through it, she was like, this is gold. These people are seeing something they've never seen before at IBM, and they are loving it. And so at the end of that week, she had this idea, let's get them on tape. And so we quickly set up a video space, and she came up with 3 questions, and we asked everybody who was in the boot camp that week these questions. And then over the weekend, I edited about a 3 or 4 minute sizzle reel of them telling their story in their words of change. And we realized as a part of that exercise that, and then we put it out on that Monday on the corporate internet to 400,000 people so that they could see their peers telling their stories. And we realized that was the voice we were looking for. And so our communications, our entire communications kind of strategy became set at that point. And it was, we're not going to evangelize this. We're going to let people going through the change and who have experienced the benefits of change tell their stories in their words. And that became hugely powerful because it's easy to dispute the new big idea raining down from above. It's much harder to dispute the person that you've been through a few fights with that is now saying, I'm a believer. It's very hard to dispute that.
Right. And a note I made in the margin of my book when I read this portion was that you edited those sizzle reels on the weekend. And I wanted to ask you about that. Why did you do that and not just pass that off to somebody else?
We were a scrappy startup. I mean, me and my leadership team, we viewed ourselves as a scrappy startup, and we were all hands on deck, and they all had stuff to do. I knew how to tell the story I wanted to tell. And so it was their words. It was my story.
Right.
That's why. I mean, and there's just some things that are, I was curious to watch all those things. I needed to know that myself. I needed to hear, I edited down, 3 hours of video into 3 or 4 minutes, but I had to go through that 3 or 4 hours of video a lot. And so I really heard them. And I think, that was important. And so for the next several boot camps, I would say probably all that first year, but certainly the next 3 or 4 or 5, that's what I did. That became my job, or one of my jobs was on the weekends, I was editing that sizzle reel. Once the format of it got out, then, and we grew our team a bit, it did become someone else's job. But
so that was my theory, was that you were telling the story by doing the editing. And it went back to, the very first thing we talked about was the branding and how important it was to tell that story, to promote that brand in the way that was like your vision.
Yeah. And, some of the things that we did was when I got a golden quote from a true skeptic or somebody from a community that was skeptical. So at IBM, there was a community called distinguished engineers, which are the most senior, most tenured, most technical people at IBM. And they were, needless to say, the most skeptical of anything they did having to change.
Right.
And so when I would get a distinguished engineer on that going, in one case, it was kind of a battalion sized team. It was a team of about 450 people. And they had been working on something. And at the end of this 1 week boot camp, he said, if we had had these practices 4 months ago, we would have saved 100 person years of work so far. Well, that's gold. So this is a great quote. It's from a skeptic, and he was skeptical when he came in on Monday morning, and everybody knew he was, and he represents the skeptical community. Well, that's going in the reel, right? And I kind of had that situational awareness of that some of my team might not quite have had about those communities around the organization. The antibodies, as you've said.
Yeah. One thing with talking about skeptics, talking about the antibodies, even the type of people that were on your team, Because again, I imagine it's you and the small team with like, looking out at an army of, 375,000 people with swords.
Yeah.
So that like the type of people, because one of the things you write about in the book is that real, like, to lead change, it takes grit and tenacity,
Yeah.
because you're constantly bumping up against other people's beliefs. And whether we want to admit it or not, our beliefs are sacred cows for any of us.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely.
and so somebody trying to change your belief all of a sudden is not trying to change your belief, they're attacking you. So could you talk a little bit about even choosing the people to lead this effort?
Sure. The criteria were basically, I needed to have people that understood the culture that I was trying to get to. These were not, by and large, in fact, of my leadership team, two at the outset knew design and design thinking. I think there were seven of us, maybe eight. The rest were culture carriers. And they were folks that I knew from past interactions, understood the culture we needed to get to. And that was way more important to me than, being experts in design or design thinking at that point. That was contained, and we could deal with that. So that was the big criteria. And the culture, the follow on from that is this: the culture we wanted to inculcate inside of IBM was a culture of yes and. Like, that's what we needed. We needed to move IBM to be much more entrepreneurial and much more focused on what you needed from us as opposed to what we wanted to give you. And so as a part of them being culture carriers and communicating that culture to the teams that were coming through the program, we had to exhibit that culture. So the other aspect of these folks was, and the reputation that we got around the organization was, we wanted to be the best team to work with inside IBM.
Right. I think like that's another misnomer that a lot of people do when they try to change. So like if it's a technological change, it's like, okay, well, we need like 5 people that are really good with technology to lead this thing through. But it's the importance of the culture carriers and the communicators. Because it really was it seemed like you had a multifunctional team that was like pushing this thing through. Because again, I think that there's a lot of stuff that we take for granted. But if you wouldn't have had those people, this project probably would have failed.
Oh, it would have absolutely failed. And we see this with AI initiatives today, where AI initiatives are all being led by AI people. And obviously the AI is what I call the change provocation. It's the instigator of the change. But ultimately, you're trying to change a culture to embrace this new tool. And I find virtually every AI effort in government and in enterprise as being too focused on the tech and not focused enough on the people and the outcomes that they're delivering.
Yeah, it's just thought just popped in my head. Like, I think Apple would have died if it was Steve Wozniak.
Sure. And he would tell you that.
Yeah. Like if it was Steve Wozniak trying to get people to try an iPhone or an iPod or the Mac, whatever, like no one would have. You needed the personality of Steve Jobs and some of the creative aspects of his personality to push that through.
Yes. Yeah. And the aesthetic of, and I'm not talking about the physical aesthetic that Steve brought, but again, Steve's a product guy. He's a product guy, and he's also a ruthless prioritizer. When he got back to Apple, he cut 7 of 10 things, and he said, we're going to make these 3 things insanely great, and we're going to make them so great that people want them. The iPhone's an interesting thing because when I was first asked to kind of educate Jenny's senior leadership team on what I was thinking for the company, one of my slides was the iPhone, which came out in 2007. What nobody remembers is that in 2006, Microsoft released a smartphone that functionally was virtually identical. The problem was they chose consistency and status quo. They chose the Windows interface, which didn't work at all in this mobile world, not like the iPhone interface with the soft, keypad and stuff like that. So again, you had this mentality of, we're going to give you a technology and you're going to use it. No, I'm not. Versus I'm going to make something so desirable that you want to use it. And oh, by the way, you're going to pay twice as much as you thought you would.
Right. And we will. And we'll line up in line every year.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you release another one.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the people thought I was absolutely crazy. I told people that the first 7 teams we paid for. That was the check essentially the company wrote. And I said, after that, we're going to charge teams to come in. And so we made teams pay to become a part of Hallmark. And they paid their cost. They paid the cost of the program, and the cost was non-trivial. I mean, just the boot camp itself for a typical team at IBM was $100,000 to $120,000 back then.
Wow, it's impressive. And something else too. Like a lot of again, I go back on my experiences, and a lot of stuff in here resonated because I think with change, and you compare it to a wedding cake, a birthday cake, and a cupcake. And I can't tell you how many times, instead of like a birthday cake or a cupcake, or even getting to the wedding cake,
right,
we just hand out slivers of cake.
Yep.
And, maybe missing the icing, maybe
Totally.
even missing the cake itself. It's just a piece of icing and like
Right.
a groom. But yeah, like it's just, again, it's just the way you frame it, and like what you actually have to do to finally get to the wedding cake. And I would argue that eventually IBM did get to the wedding cake.
Oh,
but
for
it took
sure.
a lot of cupcakes.
Yeah, it did. It does. People, we came up with that metaphor for our product teams, and it really resonates with people. And I think it's a great metaphor that, it's part of this whole. In order to go fast, you first have to go slow. But when you're going slow, what you're doing, I keep talking about these first 7 teams, and in the book I go into detail about why. But in a nutshell, when you're undergoing a transformation effort, yes, you want to impart the new tools and the new practices on the teams, but I would argue that it's even more important while you're doing that to understand what are all the forces around those teams that are stifling the adoption of the new thing. You talked about tiger teams. It's why tiger teams and innovation teams are completely worthless in transformations, 100% worthless, because it doesn't show how the existing systems and processes and people are negatively impacting the real world adoption inside an organization. And so this notion of cupcake, wedding cake is to say, look, start small, but deliver the whole experience to these few teams. And if you try to deliver the whole experience, not only are they going to be better advocates for you, but you're going to understand way better all of the forces that are against you. And then you develop the strategies and the tactics to take on those forces. Now you're ready to skate.
Yeah, that's it. Again, I think like if I would have heard this podcast episode, or if I would have read your book 10 years ago, I probably would have, like, there were so many things I tried to change in my organization when I was a commander, and I had some success, but yeah, it was just, there's things that I took for granted. And it's like you have to fail going through it to realize, and sometime by then it's too late. So I think like
Right.
reading Irresistible Change and actually having a blueprint before you try to change the thing would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, it'll at least give people a few mental models that I think that they're not getting from anywhere else. It's a different approach.
It is. All right. One final question, Phil. The picture in your office of Bob Dylan. Could you talk about the significance of that? It was mentioned in the New York Times article.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that because I actually left that. It was my personal picture. It was taken by a guy named Don Huntsman in 1965 when Dylan was in, and I'm a huge Bob Dylan fan. So anybody who knows me knows. But I like this photograph because it shows Bob Dylan, arguably the greatest, songwriter, certainly up there. And it shows Dylan at the piano in the studio, and he's got his pencil out and he's making changes. And I like to believe it was to Like a Rolling Stone, right? Or it was in that period. But I used that in our studio, not because it had any connection to IBM, but because it showed him working. And it kept me reminded, and it reminded my team every day and everybody who would come into my space every day. It showed that we have to continually iterate. There's nothing intuitive about delivering something great, especially at scale. It is work. It's a craft. And our teams have to approach their products with this mindset, but we have to approach the program with this mindset. That it's the iteration, it's the craft, it's the learning, and it's the behind the scenes work that make that 3 minute and 5 second song, go viral. There are decades of experience behind those 3 minutes and 5 seconds.
Man, that's a great way to end the episode. Well, Phil, I appreciate it. That was the one question I was looking forward to asking you the most out of.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I love that picture. And like I said, I left it there because, and I put a little note underneath it that's what it's about. And, I tell the closing anecdote in my book about being in a situation where a couple of years after I had left IBM, I was able to witness some IBM teams and some client teams do work together. And it was all of these things that came naturally to them. They didn't know who I was. They didn't realize what IBM used to look like. Both the IBM teams and the client teams were just experiencing this completely new approach to work. And it was one of my proudest moments was that. So it stuck.
Yeah, that's awesome, Phil. Well, again, thank you so much for making time today for me, this interview, for our listeners. And thank you for writing the book and not letting your experiences at IBM just kind of, fade away into lore, but just kind of laying out this blueprint for other people to follow.
You bet, Joe. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I came from the mud, there's dirt on my hands, strong like a tree, there's roots where I stand. Oh, I've been running from the law, hope they won't shoot me down soon.